Welcome to How to Talk to Kids About Anything with Dr. Robin Silverman, a podcast loaded with practical tips, powerful scripts, personal stories, and simple steps to make even the toughest conversations easier. So get ready to get the information you need to make the impact you want from someone you trust, your friend, parenting expert, Dr. Robin Silverman.
Hello and welcome to How to Talk to Kids About Anything, where we give you the tips, scripts, stories, and steps to make even the toughest conversations easier. I'm so honored to be your host, Dr. Robin Silverman, child and teen development specialist, author, and speaker, and most importantly, parent of two great kids who give me the opportunity to love, learn, and grow every single day, whether I want to or not. Believe me, I get it. It's not always easy, but we're in this together, and we have some great people helping us along the way. The pervasiveness of hookup culture, ubiquity of locker room banter, accessibility of internet porn, media steeped with distorted images, and wide acceptance of the man box or bro culture participation is having complex and negative effects on our boys. And as pornography has become a new kind of sex education that most boys are privy to by the tender age of 11, and sexual assault showing itself as a more commonplace occurrence, it's time for a change. As squeamish as it may make us, we've got to get talking to boys about sex, about consent, about empathy, porn, intimacy, media, misogyny, arousal, LGBTQ, connection. This, as you all know by now, is not just about one talk, but a series of little and big discussions along the way. It is not just for moms. It's not just for dads. This is about all of us. When we unravel the hidden truths and put high beams on the realities of young male sexuality and culture in today's world, we create a provocative paradigm shift that can help us move forward to raising more informed boys and better men. Peggy Orenstein is the New York Times best-selling author of Girls and Sex, Cinderella Ate My Daughter, Waiting for Daisy, Flux, and Schoolgirls. A contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, she has been published in USA Today, Parenting, Salon, The New Yorker, and other publications, and has contributed commentary to NPR's All Things Considered. Her new book has come out to glowing reviews and is called Boys and Sex: Young Men on Hookups, Love, Porn, Consent, and Navigating the New Masculinity. She lives in Northern California with her husband and daughter. I'm so thrilled to have you on the show, so welcome, Peggy Orenstein, to How to Talk to Kids About Anything.
Thanks so much, Robin. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm so glad to have you on. This is a really important topic. But before we get into all of the information, for those who haven't seen your book yet and haven't heard you speak, can you tell us what gets you up in the morning and what got you so interested in learning and talking about boys and how they regard sex and intimacy and consent and all that when you've been researching girls for so long?
I know, that's the big secret. I had no interest in writing about boys. I had no expectation of writing about boys. I've been writing about girls for 25 years. But after Girls and Sex came out, everywhere I went with the book, people, parents and girls and boys themselves said, when are you going to write about boys? And I thought, that's somebody else's job. But sort of the more I thought about it and realized, first of all, I'd been in that world of young people already for years. In that sexual world and that social world of how they were navigating these ideas. And secondly, nobody was talking to boys or listening to boys about any of these issues. And so then I started doing some interviews and thinking about it. And suddenly the Me Too allegations came out and there became a mandate to reduce sexual violence. But to me, it provided this really exciting opportunity to engage boys and young men in really deep conversation about sex, about intimacy, about masculinity, about gender, because we really need to know what's going on in their heads in order to help them make the best choices.
So important. Now, you laughed when I asked you what gets you up in the morning, so now I need to know the answer to that.
The alarm.
People are like, my dog, my children, coffee.
The alarm, coffee. No, I was thinking that the reason I laughed actually was because I feel like every time, I keep thinking maybe I should do something else. Maybe I should, do a different topic entirely. Maybe, intellectual curiosity about, but I just feel this, I feel impelled to keep going back to young people and gender issues and issues of personal relationships because, they're so core to our well-being, and there's such rich, um, so many rich things that we can learn about ourselves and our culture and how to, help our kids be better humans through that lens that I just keep coming back to it, coming back to it, coming back to it.
Well, you do it so well. This book is, really well written. It has just so much good information. Anybody who's raising a boy, this book is so important to talk to them about sex. And in your book, you talk about jock culture and the man box. And you say, when I asked the boys to describe the ideal guy, those boys who were coming of age in the 2000s appeared to be channeling 1955. The definition of masculinity had barely budged. So can you tell us about toxic masculinity and how toxic masculinity is affecting our boys and sex in negative ways?
Yeah. So I kind of veer away from that term, I have to say. When I use it in the book, I usually put it in quotes.
Yes, I saw that. I have it in quotes in my notes, but
yeah, because I prefer to say something, that's a little, I think it's really a useful term in terms of exposing things in the larger culture. But when we're talking to boys, it creates a kind of defensiveness that I don't think is that useful. And so I prefer to say either, precarious masculinity or hazardous masculinity or something that is less, or fragile masculinity, something that feels less like an attack on them. I just think it's more, they can hear it better. And if the goal is understanding and change, then let's do what will create that. So talking to, on one hand, it was an interesting contradiction, and probably not surprising because I saw so many contradictions in girls' lives between new expectations and old assumptions that probably we shouldn't be so surprised that boys embody those as well. So on one hand, things had changed tremendously, and boys had female friends, they had gay male friends, they saw girls as deserving of their place in the classroom or in leadership or professional educational opportunities, all that for sure. But they also, like you said, when I asked them what the ideal guy was, they went to, athletic, dominant. There was a weird combination of aggressive and chill that had come up. That was a little bit new, sort of a weird contradiction. Sex is status seeking, sex is conquest. And the big one was emotional suppression. And so much of those sort of things that we're grappling with about the way guys can be socialized into our world have to do with that emotional suppression piece. So I really made that front and center at the beginning of the book, boys talking about things about how they learned to put up a wall, they would say, or how they trained themselves not to feel, or learned not to cry, how they were only allowed happiness, anger, and really so much I felt, especially actually in talking about the book since it's come out, because sometimes you learn things about your work after it's out in the world, and I feel that what's really at the heart of this book and what radiates outward into every chapter, whether it's about porn, whether it's about masculinity, whether it's about hookup culture, whether it's about guys, in skirting the edge of assault, it's about vulnerability, and it's about the ways that guys feel this taboo against vulnerability, wrestle with it, deny it, deflect it, embrace it, capitulate to it. Because, when we cut boys off from their capacity for vulnerability and empathy and all of those things, compassion, not only are those basic human traits, but Brene Brown says that vulnerability is the secret sauce to holding relationships together. And so when we reduce that in young men, we cut off their capacity to have the very kinds of relationships, mutually gratifying, personally fulfilling relationships that we want our boys to be able to have. And that harms them, and that harms their romantic partners as well.
I think it's so important to keep that in mind, that very thing that you just said, when we are feeling really squeamish about talking to boys about these topics, or feeling like they might not listen, or, just feeling like it might be somebody else's job. Just keeping that in mind, that when we don't talk about it, these are the messages that they're getting from others. They're getting it, from society. They may be getting it from family members, friends, peers, whatever they're getting it from. And we need to be a voice. And one of the areas that really challenges people is porn, as you mentioned before. We spoke to Gail Dines about porn and from Cultures Reframed. And even so, while reading the chapter on porn in your book, I was just as disturbed as when I spoke with her. So many areas stuck out for me: the accessibility, how kids are exposed to it at an early age, the way they wind up seeing it for the first time, how it distorts their perception of sex and even their performance and connection to their own bodies, not even another person, but their own bodies, feeling disconnected. And I was struck by a story that you told about a boy named Mason who was using porn as normally as eating or brushing his teeth. I think you mentioned in the book.
Yeah,
and
sneezing.
Like sneezing. Yeah.
Sneezing.
And like in the backseat of the car when his mom was talking to his brother in the front seat. It's just disturbing. I even told my husband about that one. He's like, what? His father discovers him watching porn and has this moment, well, you shouldn't be watching that. It's bad for you. And the boy turns to his father and is like, you should really talk when it's on your computer too. And basically that just ended the discussion. Like, they had this opportunity to have this discussion. The father turned on the TV and watched something, and then that was it. Like, there was no discussion. And the boy was like telling you this would have been a really good time to have a discussion, and really was showing that he wanted to have that kind of discussion because he was lost in this. I mean, he was having a lot of struggle and felt alone in it. So what do you want us to really know about boys and porn, and what do you want us to do before they see it? Like, maybe before the kid is 9 or 10, before they have an opportunity maybe to see it. And what do you want us to do in that moment when we've discovered that they have seen it?
Right. And by the way, we need to talk to girls about this too. It's not only boys.
Agreed. I'm only limiting it because of the topic.
Yeah, I just want to put that out there.
Good
just so
point,
people know,
though.
because
Thank you.
I just was talking to somebody whose 12-year-old daughter and their friends were trading really explicit, violent porn memes on a text and sending them to people who, whether they wanted them or not, so non-consensual. And ultimately that makes me just so sad, just so sad that that's their first contact with human sexuality. It is such a bummer. And of all the things that any boy said to me, Mason, I mean, his statement that my dad failed me at that moment was profound, but also this boy who said to me, I feel like for our generation, that whole process of, going into a sexual experience and exploring sex without any preconceived notions has just been, I'll do the G-rated version, just been destroyed by porn. I mean, that is depressing.
Right. It spoke for them and educated them falsely.
Hijacks their imagination. Yeah.
Right.
So,
that kid said, that kid said you could, that kid who was like a god in his school, and they were like, he says he's not using porn at all. He just imagines and it works for him. How does he do that?
His imagination, and they're like, whoa, how does that work? They couldn't even imagine that. Yeah, I know, that's depressing too. But yeah, I think it's really, I always want to frame the porn conversation as saying, obviously curiosity about sex is natural, and masturbation, yay, super important for boys, girls, everybody beyond, in between those categories, whatever. What has changed is that in 2007, Pornhub dropped the paywall on porn. So that made it not only, the internet, not only your smartphone, but it allowed everything that you can imagine, and a lot of things you don't want to imagine, to be accessible anonymously and free. So that is what's different. And I really like with boys would say things like, explain to me exactly how you masturbate with porn. Like, how does it work? What are you doing? So things, understanding that what they will do is go through all the free sites. And if parents haven't looked at those sites, particularly mothers a lot of times haven't, they need to, because if you have some like 1970s idea of porn in your head, you are totally wrong. And just like go look at the front page of something like Pornhub or YouPorn or something. And actually, a friend, somebody said to me recently, if it's you or YouPorn, which of you is going to educate your child about sex? I think that's a really good
yes,
sign.
yes.
Yeah. But so they will like pull up, 8 clips or something, toggle back and forth quickly among them with a death grip on the penis. And, until they find the thing. I mean, and we don't really know what the impact of that is on young people, but we do know that what they're seeing over and over, and I want to talk about mainstream media too, if we can, because
yes,
I think that we get lost a little bit in the porn conversation, but, is this image of sex as something men do to women, female pleasure as a performance, for male satisfaction, a lot of eroticized violence and humiliation, even on a very low level, and a lot of acts that, frankly, wouldn't feel very good to most people, and especially to most women. And absent any discussion from trusted adults, that's their sex educator now. And, they would say a lot of different things about it. Some of the guys that I talked to said they were kind of done with it. Like, there was a small group, they said they couldn't justify their egalitarian attitudes with porn. Or one guy said to me, I'm just going to go there with this, if that's okay, that he was sitting in a classroom idly looking at a girl next to him and thinking about what she'd look like with cum on her face, was what he said. Not what it would be like to kiss her, not what she'd look like naked, and it startled him so much that he thought, I got to stop. Kind of like almost like had been drinking too much.
Right, hit rock bottom.
Right, but most of the guys, and some guys felt like Mason, like they'd been very much harmed, and I can't say whether that was true or whether that was something about them or what. But what was true was that they had never talked to anybody, any adult but me, about it. That was true. So there was nobody to help them work that through. The majority of the guys said, I know the difference between fantasy and reality, and that is what you're going to get from your son. I know the difference between fantasy and reality. Right. But really?
Really?
How?
Yeah, you haven't even had any real experience.
You haven't even kissed anybody, really. And also, what we know about media is that it affects our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, actions, even when we think it doesn't. That's why the Russians use the media to undermine our democracy, because it works, because media has an impact on how we behave. And it turns out that college guys who watch more porn are more likely to think that its images are real, more likely to want to act out its more aggressive acts in the bedroom. They are less satisfied with their partnered interactions, which I think is interesting for boys to know, less satisfied with their own performance, less satisfied with their partner's bodies. And what I think you see in that chapter in Boys and Sex is boys really wrestling with all of this. Some of them are like, no big deal, whatever, I use it every day, I don't care. But a lot of them are really wondering, what it means. A lot of them are struggling, maybe in small ways, maybe in big ways, with trying to figure out if it's having an impact on their personal relationships. A lot of them felt it did. It didn't mean they weren't going to do it, but they felt like it affected how they, their shame around their genital size. It affected who they were attracted to. It affected it certainly was affecting what they believed ought to happen in the sexual interaction. And as one guy said, the feedback you're going to get from women and what they thought female pleasure was. It certainly affected all of that. So, at best, it was something they had to get over when they got into a partnered interaction. And it was, it just, we don't have the luxury. We don't have the luxury of remaining silent about this. And I know you'd rather poke yourself in the eye with a fork than talk to your son about porn or your daughter. But we can't not do it. And mainstream media too, like I said, we get sort of, the porn is new. So we're very concerned about that, and rightly so. But the fact is that our kids are bombarded by mainstream media a bajillion hours a day. And that too is another place where it's being reinforced. Sex is something, male sexual entitlement, female sexual availability, male sexual dominance, female sexual submission. And what, can I swear?
Yes.
Okay. I always like to ask. But, one boy said to me, we were talking about all this, and he said, but, I think just the music we listen to has a big impact on how guys treat girls. You're driving around with your friends in the car all day, and you're hearing some version of fuck that bitch and quit her 4, 10, 15 times in 2 hours.
Yeah.
And
it feels really subtle, right? Like it's there in the background while you're in the car, but
right. It's also mixed in with something that is incredibly imaginative, incredibly compelling, has all these fantastic, musical qualities to it, is
Sticks
art
in the brain.
in so many ways, but is also, so you can say, but it's got all this, so I'll just ignore that. Well, that's not true. And that other stuff is still there. And of course you're not ignoring it. So if we're not, and I think that this is one area, Robin, where we have done such better work with our girls.
Yeah.
And that where we could actually, parents of boys can learn something from what parents of girls have learned, or what they themselves have learned as parents of girls, which is that, like I said, I've been writing about girls for 25 years, and we have done so much work on recognizing the harm that media messages inflict on our daughters. We know that, right? Everybody knows that. And we work from the time they are tiny to create a counter narrative for them, so that they will be armed at the very least with a critical lens that we hope, it's not perfect, it doesn't always work, but that we hope will help them resist those, crass, objectified, commodified, harmful media messages. And we say nothing to our boys, nothing. And they are growing up in the same stew. And if anything, it's turned up higher. And we think that magically they're going to come through that just fine with no problem, or they'll learn, they'll figure it out. It's unrealistic. It's doing them a service.
Agreed. And just really important points about the need to open up that discussion. So let's put ourselves then in Wyatt's house. And what would you want to whisper in Wyatt's dad's ear when he sits down on that couch?
Oh, wait, you mean Mason?
Oh, Mason. Oh, excuse me. Mason.
Wyatt is the feminist fuckboy.
Yes, yeah. We'll get to him next. Okay, yeah. Excuse me. All right. So if we're to put ourselves in Mason's house, and we are able to whisper something in Mason's dad's ear when he sits down on the couch after catching his son watching porn and has just said it's not good for you, and then is about to turn on the television, what are you whispering in his dad's ear at that moment?
You have to stop here and talk about what's real and what's not real in porn, that this is giving a skewed idea of what human sexuality is, of what people want and do and relate. Point out that there's what's missing in, you have to point out the way that it treats women, and that it's completely inaccurate about what women want, respond to, most women want, respond to, that it doesn't show any sense of connection, sensuality, messiness, playfulness, passion. That this is an abstracted idea of what sex is. And what I would really do is also have gathered some information at that point that we need to gather early on. And there's some information on my website, which is PeggyOrenstein.com, especially for high schoolers. There's an essay from Scarlet Teen, which is a great resource for parents and teens for positive, pleasurable sex education. But that essay really talks about porn from a number of perspectives, and I recommend that parents read it, and I recommend that they give it to their 14 or 15-year-old because it talks about not only what's real and what's not real in porn, but also why does the fantasy in porn hew towards the more aggressive towards women? Why, what about the fat shaming? What about the racism in porn? What about all these different things? It addresses some of those issues in ways that I think are thoughtful and that boys can hear. I think it's really important not to shame our boys or our girls around porn. I hope that this chapter would be something that boys could read themselves and wrote it to that end, because it does lay out a lot of the research, not only on, in a very neutral way, not only on the impact of porn in some of the ways we've discussed, but also things like, I really wanted to put some physiology in there so that boys could understand, for instance, the difference between what is super arousing and what is actually wanted, desired, or pleasurable. Because some of the more extreme images that they might see might provoke a genital response, right? It might give you an erection. That doesn't necessarily mean you want it. And in fact, I talk about Emily Nagoski's work and how it turns out that when something is simultaneously sexual in some way and objectionable, it can turbocharge arousal and sort of create a sort of more arousing situation than something that you actually want. And so understanding that that's just the body being the body, it doesn't necessarily mean this is what I want in my heart and my brain, can maybe help you kind of go, oh yeah, I don't really want to condition myself to these images, or I don't, this, or not feel so much. They would feel fear and anxiety over some of the things that arouse them or appear to arouse them. So understanding some of that, I think, is super helpful. And Mason, I think the end of his story is so interesting, because what he finally, he tells me this whole story about his porn use, which is on the more extreme end. And then I said to him, when did you have intercourse for the first time? And he kind of screws up his face like he's trying to remember, and he plays with this hat he's wearing, and he sort of goes, and then he says, Friday.
Yes, right. Friday.
Wait, what? Wait, what? Because it's Tuesday.
Yes.
And like 5 days ago, and he tells me a story about how he met this girl at a party, and they tried to hook up and it didn't work. And they tried to hook up again the next night and it didn't work. And the third time they try to hook up, she says, did you ever do this before? And he admits he hasn't. And she says, what did you want your first time to be like? And that starts this conversation. I mean, what an open-ended question, right? And they have this whole conversation. And I mean, it's not like they are, hugely connected and know each other super well, even so, but at least they have this conversation for a couple hours about what they wanted, what they know, how they feel, his anxiety around some of this stuff, all these issues. They have a connected conversation. And he said, and magically, it worked after that. Right. You laugh like, duh.
Right. You're like, oh, you finally felt connected.
Right. And he said, what I realized was I can't be physically vulnerable with a person unless I'm emotionally vulnerable first, because the body is a vulnerable thing. And you can't learn that from a screen. Recognizing that kids would say to me, and still say to me all the time, one of the questions I get most often when I talk to young people is, can you have sex without feelings? Because that's presented to them as an ideal.
Right. Hot
sex with a cold heart. And I mean, you could argue, well, no, because even indifference is a feeling. But I would always think, why do you want that? Why do you think that's the ideal? And that whole notion of that that I talk about in both Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex, of catching feelings like it's a disease, like you don't want to catch gonorrhea, you don't want to catch syphilis, you don't want to catch feeling, right. Like, why is that? And again, that's this sort of idea that I think both boys and girls have developed, but that fits better with the way boys are socialized, of sex as status seeking, sex as partners as disposable. Yes. And a lot of the guys, most of the guys that I met, they were wrestling with that. Although that was what they were supposed to be being socialized into, it didn't really fit with who they were.
And that was really the hookup culture that you discussed, that it feels quite different from when I was growing up anyway. I mean, it was all about boyfriends, girlfriends, and, who are you going out with? And somehow I feel like somewhere along the line, it changed over to this hookup culture where it was less about who you're going out with and who you're hanging out with. And it did seem in your book, especially, talk about feelings of emptiness and shame and negative feelings related to this hookup culture. Can you sort of paint it, this hookup culture for us, and advise us on how to help kids like that boy in your book, Wyatt, who is moving from that feeling of being a boy toy to someone who wants to invest in connection and intimacy. Right. How do we move that along when the hookup culture seems so pervasive?
Yeah, it is pervasive. And I just, before we move to that, I just wanted to give one more plug for one more research for parents in the porn talk.
Yes.
For parents of younger kids, there's a fantastic site. I don't know if you know it or have talked about it before, but called amaze.org.
Yes, right. Yes, yeah. It's great.
Amaze.org has great resources, and they have a wonderful little video about porn for younger kids, for like middle school, you know, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders that I highly recommend, and that will be of real use to parents. Anyway, so back to the hookup culture. The difference between, casual sex has always been around, obviously, to a degree. But what hookup culture is the idea that a hookup or a casual encounter precedes emotional intimacy rather than sex deriving from emotional intimacy, and that it's the normalized path to a relationship. So a hookup is the first thing on the path to a relationship rather than being an exception. And even though most hookups won't lead to a relationship, because the whole rule of hookups is to avoid catching feelings and to be less friendly afterwards than you were before. So that's kind of the, and 90% of kids say that their college campus has a hookup culture. And it's also really drifted down into high school social lives as well. So that's kind of the definition of it, and it very much prioritizes sex as status seeking, and it's not. I mean, it's presented to kids as fun, and it also, obviously, to get over that sort of fear of the awkward, hookup culture. And I've come to this idea that, okay, I said before, catching feelings is like a disease.
It does sound like that.
Right. So if you want to protect against a disease in sex, like gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, whatever, you put on your condom, right? To protect against catching feelings, you have to put on your emotional condom. And your emotional condom is alcohol. So hookup culture is not just lubricated by alcohol. That is an understatement. It is dependent.
Oh my goodness.
In order to create, Lisa Wade, who wrote this great book, American Hookup, says it creates the compulsory carelessness necessary to engage in a hookup, because, getting together with somebody that you don't know that well and don't really care about is kind of awkward. So you need to anesthetize yourself against feelings. You need to anesthetize yourself against accountability. Alcohol will often become the reason for the hookup, not like
you blame it on them, right? You blame it on
blame it on the alcohol, not on actually liking the person, being attracted to the person. So what girls in that culture would often. I mean, some of them wanted to be there, and I talk about that in Girls and Sex. But usually, for both boys and girls, the majority are ambivalent, and it tends to teach them more about what they don't want than what they do want. And the girls tended to, when they didn't like it, express more of a sense of anger and betrayal, but the guys didn't really feel it served them very well either. And they would say things like, one guy, and again, back to the vulnerability piece, like I said, I realized after how often that came up, but one boy said, it's like you're having two distinct experiences. There's not a lot of eye contact or communication, and it's like you're acting vulnerable, but you're not being vulnerable with someone you don't know very well or care very much about, which is kind of odd and not really fun. And so it really, what the hookup is about more than anything, is a kind of validation and the story that you're going to tell your friends the next day, because it sure as heck isn't about good sex.
Right.
I mean, how could it be if you're kind of smashed and you don't know a person very well. How good is that going to
be? Right. You don't know them well and you feel awkward. And it sounded like there was a lot of shame involved at the, after, and it's almost like confusion and not knowing what just happened or where anybody stands.
The talks and the conversations I would have with kids after, they would always kind of befuddle me, and we would have, it's like, I went to a pregame party as one does in middle age. All awkward. And then the next day I got together with the kids again after they had gone off to their frat party. And we were talking about all this, and sometimes I just think, seriously, you're going to spend 20 minutes talking about how terrifying it is to send the morning after text. I'm still going, a text? I mean, a text. It's such a low bar, but it was fraught for them because they had no idea what the other person was thinking. And if that person thought it was just a one-off at a party, and then you're looking like you're needy, and then you're looking like you care, and you don't want to admit that. Do you use YOU or you? And all these things. And I was just like, oh my God, that is way too much. Or like you avert your eyes from your partner from the night before. Girls were always complaining about that. Like guys would avert their eyes or ignore them in the cafeteria or whatever. And one boy was just saying, well, because you don't know what she's thinking, and maybe she's just thinking it was something that happened at a party, and you don't want to be the idiot, again, to make yourself vulnerable, and actually like say hello, because then she's going to think, you're a jerk or you're needy or, it's embarrassing. You don't want to look weak. And so I said, so you would rather avert your eyes than take the tiny risk of saying hello to your partner from the night before, because it might lead to the very, which could possibly lead to the thing you say you want.
Right.
And looked at me and went, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. So how does one then move these boys along from being part of that hookup culture to actually thinking, I want to invest in some kind of connection, like you talk about with Wyatt, and have great sex and great relationships? How do we move that along when that's the culture?
Well, again, I think that we have to break this silence, because the truth is that hookup culture is vastly overestimated by kids. And there's a huge perception reality gap around it. And I think the first thing with hookup culture, I think backing up 3 steps, we need to better educate them about positive sexuality, pleasurable sexuality, reciprocal sexuality. Boys need way better education about female pleasure, way better,
yeah, right.
And that's not a small thing. That is a really major central thing that is, a problem right now. It probably always has been, but exacerbated by the culture that we live in. So there's all that, but I think that demythologizing hookup culture and letting them know what is real and not real about it, again, just like porn, will help them have the tools to make their decisions around it. So I talk about in this chapter things like that 25% of kids on college campuses actually never hook up, that, only 10 to 15% hook up more than 10 times. The average number of partners is 7. And what are those partners doing over the course of 4 years? What are those partners doing? Well, they're not all having intercourse. 30 to 40% of college hookups include intercourse. Another 15% maybe include oral sex. The rest are kissing and groping. That is, and the word hookup is so ambiguous. It doesn't mean anything, that it allows this incorrect estimation of what your peers are doing. And that can put pressure on people to feel that they need to have sex they don't want, or that they need to be more coercive than they might otherwise be in order to keep up with peers or gain experience. So that's one piece. Understanding that, what a hookup will and will not give you. It will give you, a warm body, a war story, an adrenaline rush. Not going to give you good sex. Not give you the tools you need to have good sex or create the emotional connection that you want. Know that going in. Understand that. So that's one piece. And I think also with boys, I think that first part is true with everybody, but with boys, it also denies a fundamental capacity for love, really denies it. And so when we've been referencing Wyatt, who called himself a feminist fuckboy, which I loved, because he was scrupulous about consent, and he was egalitarian. He identified as a feminist, but he also treated partners as disposable, and he also wasn't above using the fact that his college campus had a highly skewed ratio of women to men, and that allowed to call the shots in the social culture. And so he was sort of thinking, by the time I met him, he was not feeling good about that anymore. Right. He had been feeling good about it, but he wasn't anymore. And so we were having this conversation over the course of a year. And one day we were talking via Skype. He was back at school. And another boy that I was interviewing named Nate texted me. And Nate also, he'd had bad experiences in hookup culture. He was a boy who valued connection. And he was looking at colleges where he'd been accepted, and he texted me, WTF, with hookup culture. It's like an orgy here. Do I go to Bone Town and worry about emotional connection later, or do I skip that part? You know, in case you were wondering how they spoke to me.
They didn't censor themselves.
No, they did not. And so rather than, answering him, because not a therapist,
right.
I said, Wyatt.
Yeah.
What would you say to Nate? Here's what he's texted me.
Yeah, I loved that. Yeah.
It was it was total serendipity, but amazing. They had this conversation through me about, personal authenticity, about, reality and myth around that script, around, being the person, about how doing something that isn't who you are will not serve you and will kill your soul. And Nate texted me, thank you. That was just what I needed to hear. And he sent me a little heart emoji. And I know, because I stay in touch with him, that conversation helped him when he finally did get to college, be the person that he wanted to be and in connection to other people. And I sat there thinking, they're strangers. They will never know each other. They don't even know each other's names. I'm a relative stranger to both of them, just there because I happen to be writing a book. What if we could create a situation? What if we could create space where boys could have these honest conversations with one another about what was real and what was false about that box pose and what they could do instead, and open up a broader vision of how they could conduct themselves and relate and be in this world and in our social lives? How would that support in who they are and change who they can become?
Oh, what a beautiful idea. And we're talking so much about parents and educators, being there to talk to boys about this topic, but bringing in other boys who may be further along or have a different perspective would be so useful. I could talk about this particular thing all day, but I have other questions that I like dying to ask you about, and I want to make sure that we have enough time. So I've already started talking to my kids about sex. They're now 9 and almost 11. So we've had these conversations, some of them. There is a conversation that I think is often left out when we're talking about sex. In fact, when people ask me about how to talk to kids about sex and what words do I use and that kind of thing, they're often talking about the mechanics. They're talking about reproduction maybe, but the mechanics is the thing that often scares them. But I feel like one of the areas that is really left out and that makes people squirm in their chairs often is LGBTQ. I love that you covered it in your book. I think it is so important, whether people who knows what they think about LGBTQ. We've got people who have all different views, I'm sure, listening in, but it is part of the conversation. So what do you feel like we need to talk to our boys about when it comes to LGBTQ? And I will admit to you that while I was reading just the very first chapter before you even got into anything, I wrote, should we bring in the discussion of LGBTQ? This is before I got to the chapter on it. And sort of when do we do that? So what has to be part of the conversation when you're talking about LGBTQ, not just to kids who are identifying that way, but for kids who may not be identifying that way, just all kids?
Well, obviously, we have to start. The parents of kids who they know are LGBTQ have to get better educated. And I mean, I know it's hard enough to talk about sex with your
Right.
heterosexual kid if you're heterosexual.
We're
But then
talking
you have
about
to
the
take
fork
this,
in the eye, right? Like
right.
yes, I get it.
But here is the thing with parents of those kids. I think we obviously, again, it's the contradictions. We live in a new day. We're much more accepting.
Yes.
We embrace our LGBTQ kids.
Right.
There's gay marriage is legal, all of these things. And still, there's a lot of acceptance of the social identity of being queer, but we're not talking to them about sex.
We're not.
And what I was finding with gay boys, particularly, was that they were going on Grindr when they were underage, and their parents didn't know it. Obviously, they weren't telling their friends, and they were going out and having anonymous hookups with much older men.
And this is an app, for those people who don't know, this is an app where they literally just show like a headless torso, right? Like essentially of yourself. And then you get to choose whether or not you want to have this hookup. And it's very much anonymous.
Right. And I mean, you think about a 16-year-old. I was talking to one boy who was telling me that, he said, well, of course, he was telling me about going to a hotel and having, anonymous sex with an older guy. And he said, I don't really like to go to a hotel because, I prefer to go to their houses. I think that's safer. And I just looked at him and went, are you kidding me? Right. You go to somebody, nobody knows where you are, right? Your parents don't know, your friends don't know. In a house, somebody could chop you up in little pieces and bury you in the backyard.
And there's no connection to this person. We don't even know who this is.
He doesn't even know the guy's name, and in a hotel, at least somebody could hear you scream and you have to put down a credit card, the maid will come in, something will happen,
Right.
And he just looked at me and went, oh, I never thought of that, because he's a kid.
Wow.
So, and it wasn't ideal. It wasn't what they wanted. So we do need to talk to our, and again, this is that segment of it, to our LGBTQ plus kids about what sex entails for them, what a mutual, connected, reciprocal experience entails for them. We have to give them resources about what sex between people who share the same genitals involves. We have to know ourselves what that involves. We can't shroud that in a kind of mystery over there. And I think part of the reason that it's hard for us is because it's not about reproduction.
Right.
And that, when we're not talking about reproduction specifically, we get uncomfortable.
Right.
But that's okay. And so, and also, providing, thinking as parents of kids who identify that way, how can we create situations, provide situations, social situations for them where they can have age appropriate experiences of falling in love, of, hooking up in an age appropriate way, even if it's not the way that we wish it was, whatever, that they can do what their peers are doing. And they deserve to be able to do that. Right. And it was painful for them that they couldn't do that. And I know sometimes it's hard, sometimes they're in an isolated situation, whatever, but it's important to have that conversation. It's important to think about how we can provide that, because if we don't, they are going to go engage in unsafe behavior, and, really potentially dangerous behavior, not only in terms of STDs, but, in terms of the power dynamics in relationships. And a lot of the boys that have written to me, a lot of adult men that have written to me since the book came out, have talked to me about how glad they were that I surfaced that, because they felt really harmed by it.
We need to get educated ourselves about what the mechanics look like, what consent looks like. I love that in the book you say, like, this is actually, it's when it comes to gay boys, that they're really good about saying, what are you into? Like, they're much better about it than other groups.
They were a model, not to say again that there weren't all kinds of issues and potential assault and all that, but they provided a model of how to navigate consent and negotiate a sexual experience, because they kind of had to, because it wasn't obvious what was going to happen and who was going to do what with whom and how. So they had to learn how to do that. And they were, they thought it was great. They were like, I don't get the whole heterosexual resistance to this, because if we're talking about consent, means we're going to have sex. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan Savage talks about the 4 magic words, which you mentioned. What are you into? And what I loved about that was, again, it's an open-ended question, as opposed to how we talk about consent in a heterosexual context, which is a set of questions that a boy asks a girl that are pre-prescribed, that have a yes or no answer.
Exactly.
That's not the same thing. And that said, I also thought a lot about how, and I've thought about, again, since the book's been published, if you transposed that into a heterosexual context with a young man and a young woman and said, what are you into? The girl might very well say, I have no earthly idea, because of the way we socialize girls around sex. And that's one of the ways that girls and sex and boys and sex are in conversation with each other, because you see with reading both of the books, how that socialization, how the way we talk and don't talk about sex colludes to make it very hard for young people to communicate and to create the kind of sexual experience and relationship that they want to have and that we want them to have.
Oh, I wish we weren't coming to the end of the hour, because I have so many more questions in my head, but I'm hoping we'll be able to do this again. So can you tell me, if you can finish the sentence, the most important things I want parents to talk to their boys about when it comes to sex are?
Well, I think it starts before sex. I think we have to start by by helping our boys stay connected to their vulnerability, compassion, and empathy, and broadening their emotional range. That starts when our boys are very little, by naming emotions for them beyond anger, by saying things to them like, it seems like you're sad, it seems like you're frustrated. When they're angry, recognizing that there's often emotion under that anger that needs to be named, because boys lose that. They lose the capacity to name emotions. By the time they're adult men, they have a far reduced capacity compared to women, and the ability to recognize the emotions they feel in their bodies, and they funnel it to anger. And that, as we know, is a problem. So I would say starting there, talking about consent for sure. And parents need to really, and I lay out in the last chapter a series of conversations that I think that parents need to have with kids. But I do lay out the contemporary definition of consent, because if you don't know it, and if you're not crystal clear about it with you are putting him in danger of harming somebody and of having to face the consequences for that harm while not realizing that he has done so. I think we have to make gender dynamics super visible. And I talk about a lot of the gender dynamics that boys learn and girls learn that can get in the way of them perceiving what's consensual, and allow them to rationalize or stretch their definitions of consent past the boundaries of what is in fact consensual. I think that all of this, I'm trying to get across that it isn't the talk. Right. It isn't only about mechanics, and it isn't only about intercourse. And it's not even, just about sex. We have to really have a broad set of conversations, as we said, about media, both mainstream and sexually explicit media. We have to promote the healthy and, gotta say it, name the toxic, to help guys recognize what that man box is and how it can sabotage their well-being and their ability to have relationships. I mean, all of this is about the long game of wanting our young people to have the kinds of relationships that are mutually gratifying, that are personally fulfilling, and helping our young men become the boys that the men that we know that they can be, to become their best selves.
Absolutely. Echoing so much of what Richard Weisbord said to us also about consent, but also very much beyond consent, and creating those caring relationships, those connected, caring relationships. And he's like, who cares about, what the girl is this way or that way, or, you had this conquest, or you did, you were able to achieve this. Nobody cares about that. At the end of the day, it's really about that connection, that caring relationship, what fulfills you, what gives you love, when you can give love to somebody else. And that has to be part of the conversation. It can't just be the mechanics, or even, yes, of course we need to be talking about consent, but it can't just be about consent, as you say in your book as well, because that doesn't make it, while it makes what you say, it makes sex legal, but it doesn't necessarily make it good. And I think that's really an important aspect that we need to bring in the talk. My first initial talk with my daughter when she was younger wound up lasting an hour. I mean, I stumbled a little bit through the mechanics when she was asking me about it, and it was surprisingly a short component of what we wound up talking about. And I honestly was so grateful for that talk. I can't even begin to tell you, and I couldn't have orchestrated it. I mean, it just happened the way it did, but we did talk a lot about love and tenderness, and she asked me, and I remember this one question. She said, "Does it hurt?" And I talked to her about when you're fully connected with somebody, when you love somebody, and you feel just that you're in the right place at the right time with the right person, then it can be beautiful and feel wonderful. But if you're in a situation when you're with somebody who you don't care about, you don't feel connected to, you don't want to be there, then it can hurt very much, both physically and emotionally. And I'm just grateful that I was able to have that conversation with her. And I know that there's many more that I need to have. And, as my son is growing up too, and we're having more conversations with him, that these are conversations that we need to have so that we broaden the talk to many, many talks that we have, because we're creating a multifaceted man. We're not just talking about this one thing. So can you give us your top tip? What do you want us to come away with from this talk that we're having today?
It's got to be start the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, you have, and I know it can be hard. Yeah. I know it can be hard because, we weren't raised this way. Maybe you can't talk to your partner very well, and especially for adult men, because when adult men can speak with compassion and listen with compassion to their boys, it makes such a difference. And boys, express such a desire to hear from fathers or whoever the adult male role model was in their life. Not only about, like you said, not just about sex, but about intimacy and about their own regrets along the way, about their own journey. And I know that's not natural for a lot of adult men.
Right.
But what I want to say about that is you don't need to be perfect. You don't need to know all the answers. You don't need to know all the questions. You can come back and say, I really blew that. You can, if you haven't had a talk with your son and he's 16 or 20, you can say, gosh, we never had these talks.
Yes.
That was wrong.
Yes.
I want to start having these talks. You just, and again, you may not have the perfect relationship. You may not be able to talk that well to your partner, but you can make a difference here. And just enter the conversation where you can, however you can, just start it.
I love that you talk about getting the men involved in the conversation, the dads in the conversations. I did have this one situation where I heard my son asking his dad about what sex was, and I tiptoed past that room. And my husband said to me later, he was like, "Why didn't you come by? This was really challenging." I was like, because it was perfect. He was asking you about it, and that was the person he decided to ask about it. And so that was your conversation to have. And I'm happy to have conversations with him later, but it's great that you had that opportunity. And he said it really wasn't so bad, but I did hear from the room at one point, "Ew."
And it's okay.
That's fine.
It's okay to be, you can even laugh about it. Like, oh, we're going to have one of those awkward conversations.
Yeah.
But you can, it gets easy. I mean, I got to say, I was not born being able to, get onto a podcast and have a discussion about, blowjobs. That was not who I was.
This is not my bag either. It's not like I was born this way.
You learn. and you learn by, shouting the other, shouting at your child's back as they are fleeing from the room.
Yes.
Too much information. Okay,
Yes,
but you
right.
heard me, right?
Yeah.
We'll revisit this. Don't think you or you have the conversation in the car or whatever. But it's once you start, you can only you got to exercise the muscle.
Yes.
It's a weak muscle, and it gets stronger. And the earlier you start, the better. But that doesn't mean that you can't start later. And you can also enlist, others. Like if you have the cool aunt, the cool uncle, the gay best friend, the neighbor that your child is close to, you can task them with having some of these conversations or being the person that they can talk to as well. If for when they can't talk to a parent, you can enlist your community.
That is a good idea. That is a good idea to be, especially if you feel so uncomfortable that you're like, you know what, if they don't do it, it's not going to get done. So let's make sure we're enlisting help, at the very least, to make sure somebody in a trusted position is having these conversations. I mean,
I'll tell you, I think this was even before I started writing. It was before I started writing Girls and Sex. The other day I was on a call-in NPR show, and my sister-in-law called in.
Oh gosh, how funny.
I know, it's really funny. And she did because she wanted to say this. She wanted to say sometimes it's not the parents. And even if you have a great relationship, even if you can have these conversations, you might need that other person. And she said that she had, and this was true, when her oldest was a teenager, she asked me if I would have these conversations with her daughter. And I remember going out to lunch with her daughter, who had a significant boyfriend at the time, and having this conversation with her and wanting to I wanted the earth to swallow me up. I just was desperate.
I can totally know that feeling. Yes.
Because I was sitting there saying things like, so, maybe you're thinking about intercourse, but maybe there's some questions you want to ask yourself first. Like, have you had an orgasm with your partner in other ways? What, if not, why do you want to be having intercourse? What is it that you think of as sex and sexual experience? What is the purpose and the, what are you communicating? All these different questions. And thinking, oh God, save me.
Yes, save
and she's
me.
Sitting there, like staring at me, still as a mouse. But it was a really important conversation, and opened up doors in our relationship, so that over the years, she's now 28, I think, and true with my other nieces and nephews too, that they contact me with all kinds of questions and discussions.
Beautiful
we have
position.
Not only around sex and relationships, but around career, around friendships, around whatever is going on in their lives. We text constantly. We talk a lot. We're very, very close. And I really honestly believe that that's because when they were younger, I showed up without fear and without judgment in their lives. And that relationship, so it's not just an opportunity. It's not just awkward. It is really an opportunity to start scaffolding a different kind of adult relationship with your child that is rich and that is close. And so to keep that in mind too, I think really helps when you're feeling that sense of dread, because nobody ever talked to you. And we have learned we're supposed to feel a sense of dread around these conversations. And that is an American thing, by the way. That is not universal.
Wow. Yes. And, coming to this conversation and all other conversations without fear and judgment, that is one of those messages that we really need to hit home. Give us the resource of the week. Where can we go to get more information about you, your book, and all the great work you're doing?
My website is PeggyOrenstein.com. There we go. Which has not only information about me and my books, but there's a page of information in the resources section, a long page that will give you the tools for you to be able to build your own script and your own sex education class and your own relationship education class for, depending on the gender, the sexual orientation, the age, the stage of your child. So all of that is there.
Oh, thank you so much, Peggy. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I love your insight. I love your strategies. I love your scripting. I love your help in all of these areas and just bringing them to light. I loved what you've been saying about just getting in there and having that conversation and that series of conversations, creating the relationship that allows for that kind of exchange, and really that is the model for what we want our kids to have with other people in their lives. We want them to feel connected and fulfilled by their relationships. And this is just one avenue to make sure that they do. So thank you very much for coming on the show today.
It was a great pleasure, Robin. Thank you.
Well, I've got my takeaways, and sweet friends, I know you have yours, so let's discuss them. Come up on Facebook, go to the Dr. Robin Silverman page, or let's chat about it at drrobinsilverman.com, twitter.com/Dr. Robin. I'm also on Instagram under Dr. Robin Silverman. I will be going back and forth with Peggy Orenstein. She said so many things today that I'm going to make sure are on memes so that you can share them. I know how much you love that. And if you love this podcast like I did and you know how useful it was, would you kindly go up to iTunes and rate and review it so other people will learn about Peggy Orenstein and all the great solutions and work that she is doing in this area so that they can use them in their own homes. I truly appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today, my fellow parents, leaders, and educators. Thank you so much for tuning in to How to Talk to Kids About Anything. For more information on books, articles, speaking engagements, or curriculum, please visit drrobinsilverman.com. So many great podcasts are up there, and the show notes to this podcast with her link will be up there as well. I look forward to weathering the storms and enjoying the sunny side of life together. And please remember, even on the days when you fall short, you've got this. You're here. You're getting the information you need. I know it's not easy, but never forget there's always tomorrow. Parenting is the ultimate do-over. Perhaps you heard something today about talking to boys about sex or intimacy or consent, and you thought, I haven't done this, or I messed up that conversation, or I shut that conversation down when I should have opened it up. Don't do that to yourself. This is not about bashing ourselves. This is about giving ourselves the opportunity to go back and say, I want to have the conversation now, or I messed up and I apologize, and let's open this up again. This is that time. I see you and I'm right there with you. And as there are moments when we doubt our know-how, our choices, and our sweet sanity, please know you're 10 times the parent you think you are. Until next time, this is Dr. Robin Silverman with How to Talk to Kids About Anything. Please tune in again and keep connecting through conversation. See you next week.
You've been listening to How to Talk to Kids About Anything with Dr. Robin Silverman. For more information on books, articles, speaking engagements, or curriculum, please visit drrobinsilverman.com.